Well, Dr. King, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And firstly, I'd like to ask you, when was your first encounter of Matsuo Basho, whom I think many people regard as the greatest haiku poet that Japan has ever produced?
I don't really remember. When I was a child, I was given an encyclopedia which had 3 volumes dedicated to foreign countries. One was France, another one was Holland, and the third was Japan. I don't know why they were chosen, but the Japanese volume, which I remember very well, had curved breeze, taikobashi, and they had young ladies with parasols, and there were haiku scattered throughout the text. And probably some of them were by Basho, but I really don't remember which ones. My first real encounter with Basho came after the end of the war in 1945. I returned to Columbia University, where I studied under my great teacher for life, Tsunoda Ryusaku. And he taught, among other things, a seminar on Genroku period literature. We read works by Saikaku, the 5 Women Who Loved Love. We read the play by Chikamatsu, The Battles of Kotsunya. And then we read The Narrow Road to Oku of Basho. And I loved the work from the first encounter with it, although it was difficult. Mm-hmm. And I've taught it many times with students and enjoyed it each time.
What attracts you to this literature?
The attraction is in this particular work, which is Basho's masterpiece. It is a human being and his relations with the world around him, particularly with nature. Basho traveled in a part of Japan which up until this time was not celebrated. People didn't go there very often for pleasure. And he managed to show that it was a wonderful place, wonderful treasures of nature and also man-made. He also did something which changed the composition of haiku, and that is, up until this time, haiku, like the waka which preceded it, were devoted mainly to spring and autumn, the 2 seasons par excellence. But because this journey was in summer, summer poems suddenly became popular, and they remained popular because of Basho. No one has done the same thing for winter, I'm afraid.
Maybe it's not a good time to travel. And what about the work Oku no Hosomichi, by the way, you have translated?
Yes.
In the book of translation was published in 1996.
Yes.
You have the title The Narrow Road to Oku.
Yes. Yes. This translation was started in 1945. And at that time, I was pretty confident in my ability as a translator. And I showed it to someone whose opinion I respected. And he said, "You told me this was very beautiful, but it's very boring." And I was quite disappointed. The reason it was boring, as I gradually realized, was that whenever there was a difficulty in the text, something that was not immediately apparent to a Western reader, I explained it. And explaining deprived the work of its poetic quality. Mm-hmm. An explanation is not a poem. And so people reading what I had written were actually reading not a translation, but a translation plus a lot of unnecessary explanation. And that caused people to think it was boring. So having had this rebuke, which was deserved, I kept translating it over and over until finally the opportunity arose to publish it here in a volume of its own with woodcut, not woodcut, but paper cut illustrations by Miyata Masayuki, who was a marvelous artist, and it was a joy to make the book. It was I had the opportunity to do anything I pleased over and over with the poems. One can never be satisfied. If you love the Japanese language, you know it does certain things that English cannot do. And you keep trying to come closer and closer to the Japanese. You know you will fail in the end, but you hope you'll come a little bit closer each time until perhaps Basho won't be ashamed of me.
And I'm sure he's not. But I think I'd like to explain to our listeners that haiku is such a short form of poetry that even in haiku poetry readings, people will actually explain why the feelings that they have put on in the haiku to begin with, because there's just too few syllables to explain.
Yes. That is
the real picture.
That is what gives it its unique quality. It doesn't say everything. An English poet, a poet writing in the English language, if he writes a good first stanza, will think, well, I can write another one too, and another one. And usually the second and third stanza are not as good as the first one. The excitement is in the first stanza, but the Japanese, without that possibility, at least in this form, tried to put whatever they could into it and to remove everything that was not necessary. If there is a kind of shorthand, if you say something like the name of a flower, you don't have to say the daisies of summer, because just the word daisy would tell you that it was summer, not spring or autumn. You don't have to say, if you're talking about the moon, that it's the autumn moon, because Japanese traditionally looked at the moon in the autumn, and so it was the autumn moon. If you wanted to talk about the spring moon, then you have to qualify it saying it was spring moon. Otherwise, it would automatically be autumn. There are problems of that kind, which only a person experienced or has some sort of help in it would know the first time. But once you've had the explanation and you go back to the original, you realize it's so much better without the explanation. It's so much better without these clues. You have to make a leap of imagination at times. Usually there are two factors in a haiku. One is a general now situation, and the second one may be an abstract idea, which is stems from this visual image. And the connection may not be obvious at first, but if you think about it, if you give the poem its due time, you'll feel the excitement. Basho was the greatest of the haiku poets, and he composed haiku poetry, I should say, for 30 or 40 years, but in all that time, he only wrote 1,000 of them. It's very easy for poets today to put out a volume of haiku with 100 or 200 poems. It's normal. And there are people who have written thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of haiku, but Basho was not satisfied. He kept on trying to come closer to the heart of what he wanted to say, the perfect image to create the mood or the thought that was in his mind, or captured a sight which he saw in a very, very few words. And so if he has given so much time to composing it, you must give time too. You can't expect on the first glance to catch the whole of it. That would be looking down on Basho. You've got to give you something of yourself, your knowledge of the world, your knowledge of human feelings, to understand him. But once you've made that effort and once you get into his world, you'll find it's not like any other.
Maybe you can cite some samples?
Well, I'll give you a sample, which is one of the times where I think I succeeded particularly well. It's a poem, it's a haiku, which is in a sense a paradox. It says, Shizukashaya, iwa ni shimiru, semi no koi. How still it is here, stinging into the stones the locust trill. When you say it's still, you expect there won't be any noise at all. But instead he says that this trilling of the locust sound, this yee sound of the locust, is so sharp that it goes into stones. It pierces into stones. So it's a contradiction. He's saying it is still, and yet it is filled with the sound of this sharp sound of the locust. What does this mean? It means really that, as far as I know, it means that it's only when you have noise that you can know silence. When the locust trill stops for a second, then you feel the intensity of silence. It's almost a tangible silence that you feel. I'm pleased with this translation for a peculiar reason. I tried to, in the original, let me exaggerate a bit in reading this Shizu Kasaya Iwa Nishimi Iru Semi no Koe. In it we have Iwa Ni Shi Ni, the sounds of E E E E, Shin Iwa Ni Shimi Iru, and then the Semi. You have the sound of E just going through it, and that is the sound of the semi. It's in the poem, in the Japanese language. I couldn't do that in English. I did it with something else. I said, how still it is here, stinging into the stones, the locust trill. We have this key combination, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, which I tried to. It's a different sound. It's not E, it's a ST sound, which at least I tried to give an idea of the repetition of a sound which goes on that basho, when it breaks the sound, he can hear the silence.
That's wonderful. And can you tell us about the book, or Oku no Hosomichi, The Narrow Road to Oku, for our listeners who may have not read a translation of it?
Basho, in the year 1693, decided he'd make a journey to the north of Japan. As I've said, it was not a popular destination for travelers who more likely went to famous temples in the south, in the Kyoto, Nara area. That was a normal place to go. There were travelers who went to the north. One of the travelers who went to the north was a poet whom Basho revered above all other poets, and that was Saigyo, who was a priest and a poet. And he did not like living in the cities among other people, and he deliberately sought out hermitages in the remote parts of Japan. He went to the north, and Basho, in a sense, was following in Saigyo's footsteps, not literally, but in the same general area. And it was the 500th anniversary of the death of Saigyo, and that was probably the reason he chose that particular year to make the journey. And he went to the part of Japan about which relatively little poetry existed. There was some, and wherever there was a poem, Basho went to the place where the poem had been composed to see if that place could fill him with poetic inspiration, give him the kind of inspiration that it gave a poet 200 years, 300 years before. This was important to him, to see the places that had inspired poetry. And he saw places which today, if you saw them, wouldn't seem terribly interesting because time has changed the face of them. But Basho at that time still saw much the same Japan, north of Japan, as people had seen 500 years earlier. Today, if you took the same course, you'd have to try very hard not to see a factory or an amusement park or anything else, because after all, people there want their amusements, and it isn't sufficient for them to have historical associations. But if you go to the Chusonji, for example, a great temple which Basho visited, and you could still see the building which Basho saw, and Basho was so moved by it, this great kondo, the Hall of Gold, and he saw the images of the Buddhas there, which filled him with awe, and it was it was a great moment for him, and it will still be a great moment. You could also go to Hagoromo, or a mountain, which is still beautiful. It's still, you can feel the experience of being Basho and traveling without any interference from 21st century Japan. There are still places to see, but in his day, this was a relatively unknown part of Japan, and as a result, people now treasure his memory more than they would if he had gone to Kyoto, because lots of people went to Kyoto. But if you go now to Yamagata-ken, there are little museums and there are other things which celebrate Basho's having visited Oishida, wherever it happens to be, and it is important to these people that Basho was here 350 years ago, whatever it is. So he, in a sense, gave the people an occasion for local pride. Basho was here. It's a place that Basho himself visited. And it's a combination of creating a great work of literature and changing the world of poetry by having visited there.
Okay. Well, I think I could talk to anyone who lives in Japan who's a Japanese, and anyone could recite at least 2 or 3 poems by Matsuo Basho. He's very, very popular. Yes. But I don't think many people have actually read his work.
They may not have read the whole thing, but I think they must have got excerpts from it in high school readers. The year of the 300th anniversary, which was 1993, it was impossible to get a ticket on any train going to Tohoku region because everyone wanted to go on the 300th anniversary to see the places that Basho had seen. And it was a great occasion. People, even if they hadn't read Uko no Hosamichi themselves, they knew about it, and they knew how important a work it was. I don't know any single work, any other work of literature that would have that effect. Nothing by Saikaku would cause people to go to Osaka, and nothing by Shikamatsu would induce people to have a love suicide. But this is something special. It is, I should say, the favorite work of the Japanese, even those who haven't read it. But most people will have read at least the opening and a few other sections of it. They know what it's about. And it's also of great appeal to non-Japanese. A number of non-Japanese have made the Uko no Hosamichi route. I went a long time ago. It was still not popular in 1955, but a young English woman has made a film of it. She traveled with a cameraman all the way where Basho had gone until they reached the Japan Sea. An American composer has composed an Uko no Hosamichi suite of music, and so on. It's captivating to anybody who reads it.
And I may be repeating a question in a different way, but what attracts people to this literature, do you think?
Each people must have its literary classics. And people in England and the United States will turn to Shakespeare. They know a few lines of Shakespeare. There's nobody who's never heard of Shakespeare. And in Japan, it's basho. People will know a few haiku about him. At least the poem about the frog jumping into the well. Everybody has heard about that. And so this becomes a classic in a way that no other writer has. No matter how much you worship, let's say, Natsume Soseki's novels, I don't know anyone who could recite a page or two of Natsume Soseki, but many people can recite.
Maybe,
can recite parts of Haiku no Hosimichi.
So it definitely is very much part of the Japanese culture.
It's part of the culture, and it's the famous poem of Basho's when he sees the stone that was erected hundreds of years ago, and he realizes that this is a place where people have lived and been in for a long time. He says that mountains may disappear, rivers will change their course, everything will change, but words remain. This is an extraordinary statement. There's a Japanese saying, actually, derived from China, Kuni yaburete, sanka ari. Although the country is defeated, the mountains and the rivers remain. Basho is saying no. Mountains disappear, they crumble, they fall down. Rivers disappear, but words will last. The words of human beings, and that's true of Basho. His words have lasted. The Tokugawa regime, which he admired, has ended. All the sites he saw, many of them have disappeared, and yet his words just will last forever, as long as the Japanese language lasts. Many people in the West are interested in haiku. There are haiku societies in most European, United States, Canada, and anyone who is interested in haiku will automatically have to know Basho. You can't say, I like someone better, therefore I'm not going to read Basho. And even people who are not interested in composing themselves will recognize, if they've ever seen Basho's writings, even a few poems, and certainly if they've read the Narrow Road to Oku, they will realize that this is a world figure, somebody who will last as long as any figure of world literature lasts. There are 4 or 5 translations. They're all very different. For example, the first words of Haiku no Hosimichi are tsukihi, which has 2 possible meanings. One is tsuki, meaning the object in the sky, tsuki, and he's talking about the sun, the moon and the sun. It also could mean months and days. Both meanings are possible in Japanese. And I think a Japanese wouldn't have to choose. They could take them both ways. But in English, you have to choose. Which is it going to be sun and moon, or is it going to be months and days? I chose months and days, but if someone said they prefer moon and sun, I couldn't disagree with them. That's a matter of personal preference. Any case, there are many possibilities in a work like this. It's a poetic work, not a work of precision in the language, but a work of evocation. And therefore, it will evoke different responses in people according to their sensitivity, according to their experience of poetry.
Actually, quite surprised that people captured so many different nuances in the poem, because I thought there would just be one.
Yes. Well, that poem can be analyzed in every conceivable way. It seems like a simple statement and a very uninteresting statement. A frog jumped into a puddle of water. What's interesting about that? Someone might ask. But if you think of it, it's the first words, Furuike, old pond. This is very strange in a way. All ponds are old. There are some artificial ponds, but almost all ponds are. Oh, why did Basho have to waste 2 precious syllables in saying furu instead of just saying ike all by itself? Well, I think he wants to emphasize something that lasts forever. this is something that the pun has been there for a long, long time. It is, as it were, a horizontal component, something that doesn't change. The pond is there. And into this, from above, comes a frog once, plop, makes a noise. So the horizontal of eternity is interrupted by the momentary of the frog jumping in. And there one has a realization of time. What is time? You have eternal time and extremely short time coming together. That's one way of translating it or interpreting it anyway. And you have to look at every single syllable before you can come up with any theory of what it means. And once you've come up with a theory, you must be patient and you must be tolerant of other theories, because there are a lot of possible ways. And that is a good mark of a good haiku. Ambiguity, traditionally in the West, was considered to be bad, that you should be clear. You should have one meaning, and you state that plainly. But that was not true in Japan. Even in the earlier poetry, the waka poetry, there's an area of uncertainty. You don't know exactly what it means.
And, how do you depict the man himself, Matsuo Basho?
Basho was a person who was probably he would have a person who liked solitude, who liked thinking, being by himself, but he had to live in the city. He had to be with disciples. He had to be given the excitement of the city too. So he chose to live not in the mountains, but in the city of Edo. And people would visit him all the time, except when he put up a sign, "No visitors," and then they would stay away. But he was essentially a person of quiet, of silence, I would say. And he was averse to having his private life, should say, his private worries aired. He doesn't say, let's say, how he felt towards his brother, or he doesn't say whether he ever fell in love. He doesn't say any of the things you expect a person to say. That he said is not your business. I am going to talk only about what really absorbs me, which are the eternal things. I'm not eternal. I'm just a passerby. Basho does not name himself in his work, Oku no Hosomichi. He doesn't say, I, Basho, saw this. The only person, or there are several people named, but the man who travels with him, his assistant, Sora, is named, and his description of Sora, but nothing about Basho himself. And I think this is sometimes puzzling to non-Japanese who read it. So why doesn't he say who he is? But it does. For him, it didn't matter who he was. He is the poet. He is the poet traveling, seeing, feeling things, and that was enough. And the reader shouldn't try to find out more than the poet wishes him to know.
So in your lectures, would you tend to focus merely on his works rather than on himself?
Yes, I have. I could, if students ask me questions about Basho and his family and so on, I'm willing to talk about it, of course. At one time, it was considered terribly important to prove that Basho came from the common people, that he wasn't a samurai.
He wasn't.
He wasn't. That was when I was first in Japan. This was a very strong theory, but in fact, it's quite clear he was of the samurai class. It doesn't make any difference. Because he was in the samurai class, he didn't act like a samurai. He didn't carry a sword. Didn't do any of those things. It was a fact of his existence. It helped him to gain a certain amount of instruction in poetry. He studied with the son of the local daimyo, and so that gave him a certain amount of instruction he would not have received as an ordinary commoner. But that's not the important thing about Basho. The important thing is that he was a great poet. He wrote wonderful poetry, and the poetry is as good for us as it was for him and his time. We don't feel, when reading Basho's poetry, I wish I knew more about the political organization of the Tokugawa shogunate. That's the last thing in the world you would think of.
So do you still read Matsuo Basho for your own pleasure?
Yes, I do, and I read it for my own pleasure, but also I read it with students. Like any teacher, I'm basically a missionary. I want to transmit the truth to my students. I want to convert them to Bashoism.
Well, I hope you continue to be a missionary for our Radio Japan listeners and introduce more Japanese authors in the near future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Donald Keene, Professor Emeritus of Japanese